You've probably been told that sanctions are the ultimate tool to weaken China. That if you cut off access to technology, capital, or markets, Beijing will crumble. But what if I told you that the opposite is happening? That the very strategy the West thinks is crippling China is quietly making it stronger? Let me show you what most mainstream narratives get wrong. First, ask yourself this. Why has China's economy grown even as the US and EU ramped up their sanction toolkit over the last 5 years? The conventional wisdom says trade restrictions, tech bans, and financial barriers should slow them down. Yet, China's GDP in 2025 reached $19.9 trillion, up from $14.3 trillion in 2018, despite increasingly aggressive sanctions. That's not rounding error. That's real, measurable growth under pressure. Here's what matters. Sanctions aren't just economic tools, they're signals, and China reads them differently than most Western analysts assume. While the West sees isolation, China sees incentives to accelerate self-reliance, innovation, and domestic resilience. When I was in Beijing last year talking to senior executives at a Shenzhen semiconductor firm, they told me bluntly, every time the West shuts a door, we build a window. Sometimes, we even make it bigger than the door they closed. Now, let's break this down systematically. I like to think in terms of 3 forces, 3 interlocking systems that together explain why sanctions are strengthening, not weakening, China. The first is technological substitution and innovation. The second is financial autonomy and strategic reserves. The third is geopolitical realignment and supply chain control. Today, we'll focus on the first. Force number 1, technological substitution. Sanctions are designed to restrict access to high-end chips, advanced manufacturing equipment, and critical software. The assumption is simple. If China can't buy it, it can't build it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Chinese firms are not just finding workarounds. They are accelerating domestic development at breakneck speed. For instance, Chinese chipmaker SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, reported in 2024 that it had increased production of 14-nanometer chips by 73% year-on-year, despite U.S. export controls preventing access to certain lithography machines. Let me show you what this actually means. Instead of being crippled, China is now less dependent on US and European technology than it has been in decades. They are turning vulnerability into a competitive edge. Think of it like a paradox. The weapon meant to weaken them, the technology ban, is actually forcing them to build a domestic arsenal of innovation. Here's what nobody tells you. This isn't just about companies. It's state-backed, coordinated, and relentless. China has poured $297 billion into semiconductor R&D over the last 3 years alone, a level of investment that dwarfs any single European country's entire tech budget. And they aren't just copying, they are adapting designs specifically to bypass restrictions, creating technology ecosystems that are uniquely Chinese and increasingly independent. Stay with me, because this connects to something even bigger. Consider consumer tech. When Apple faced supply chain slowdowns in China, domestic firms like Huawei and Xiaomi didn't just survive, they expanded market share and diversified globally. In 2024, Huawei's global smartphone shipments reached 83.6 million units, reclaiming market segments many analysts thought were lost forever. That's the kind of resilience sanctions inadvertently incentivize. Here's another critical layer, knowledge spillover. Chinese universities, startups, and research labs are absorbing talent and expertise from sectors where Western firms previously dominated. I talked to factory workers in Shenzhen who transitioned from assembly lines into AI chip development programs funded by government-private partnerships worth tens of billions. This is exactly the type of capability that can't be bought. It has to be grown internally. So, let's summarize force number 1. Sanctions were supposed to slow China down. Instead, they've triggered a cycle of domestic innovation, state coordination, and strategic industrial investment. The paradox is stark. The more the West tries to cut off access, the more China doubles down on self-sufficiency, and in some cases accelerates beyond where it would have been without pressure. And that's just the first layer. The second system is even more sophisticated. And it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening. Let me show you. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. If Force 1 was about technology, Force 2 is about financial autonomy and strategic reserves. While the West thinks sanctions are choking China's economy, here's the uncomfortable truth. Beijing has been quietly turning pressure into power. Ask yourself, why does China hold over $3.2 trillion in foreign reserves, the largest in the world? Conventional thinking says these reserves are just a safety net, but the real story is far more strategic. These reserves are leverage, liquidity, and a buffer that allows China to maneuver politically and economically in ways that most Western policymakers fail to anticipate. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In 2024 alone, China moved roughly $453 billion of its reserves into non-dollar assets, including euros, yen, and gold. That's not just diversification, it's a deliberate weakening of the dollar's grip on global finance, and it creates a parallel system that can insulate China from sanctions. Here's what most analysts get wrong: the assumption that financial sanctions work the same way on a country with both the world's largest reserves and a controlled capital flow system. They don't. This isn't theory. I talked to a senior economist off the record who described Beijing's approach as pre-positioning chess. They aren't reacting to sanctions, they are anticipating them, stockpiling critical resources, and restructuring financial networks so that Western tools lose their bite. It's why China's sovereign wealth funds now hold $1.2 trillion in strategic investments abroad, targeting everything from rare earths in Africa to high-tech startups in Europe. This is the part that should terrify you. The very mechanisms the West relies on to coerce China, financial pressure, asset freezes, trade restrictions, are increasingly impotent. Here's what matters. Financial autonomy isn't just about reserves. It's about creating alternatives to dollar-dominated systems. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, isn't just infrastructure. It's a financial and trade network that ties dozens of countries into a China-centered ecosystem. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, now handles transactions valued at over $2.7 trillion annually, providing an alternative to SWIFT and reducing exposure to Western control. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because what comes next connects to something even bigger: supply chain realignment. While Force 2 fortifies China's finances, it also empowers them to shape the global economy on their own terms. Consider the lithium market. China controls more than 70% of global processing capacity for lithium, a critical component for batteries. Combine that with strategic reserves and financial independence, and suddenly, China isn't just surviving sanctions. They are shaping which countries get access to the future of energy and technology. Here's what nobody tells you. Sanctions create a kind of economic feedback loop. Western restrictions encourage China to develop substitutes and alternatives, which then become leverage against the West itself. It's almost ironic. The tools intended to weaken China are funding its rise, financially and strategically. Now, let's add a real-world case study to make this tangible. In 2023, when the U.S. imposed restrictions on rare earth exports to limit China's access to advanced electronics manufacturing, Chinese companies didn't just source elsewhere. They invested directly in domestic mines and processing facilities. Within 18 months, China increased domestic rare earth production by 14.7%, reduced dependency on imports, and even started exporting to Europe under favorable contracts. Essentially, the sanction designed to hobble China ended up strengthening its resource security and created a new revenue stream. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. These aren't short-term fixes. We're talking about structural shifts in finance, trade, and industrial strategy. China is using sanctions as a catalyst to re-engineer its economy from top to bottom. And while the West debates the morality or effectiveness of sanctions, China quietly ensures that future shocks, whether political or financial, will have less impact. And that's the beauty of Force 2. It's invisible to most analysts. While everyone is focused on trade deficits, tariff wars, and headline GDP numbers, the real story is China's quiet accumulation of autonomy, strategic reserves, and alternative financial networks. The paradox is clear. The stronger the West pushes, the stronger China's financial resilience becomes. Stay with me, because Force 3 is where this all comes together. It's not just technology, it's not just finance. This final force reshapes the global order itself, and when you see how it works, you'll understand why traditional Western strategies might be fundamentally misaligned. Now we move to Force 3, and this is the one that changes the stakes entirely. If Force 1 was technology and Force 2 was financial autonomy, Force 3 is geopolitical realignment and supply chain control. This is where the uncomfortable truth hits hardest. The West's sanctions are unintentionally pushing China to rewrite the rules of global power. Ask yourself this. Why has China spent over $188 billion on Belt and Road infrastructure projects in just the last 3 years, even as Western media frames these moves as debt traps? Most people think this is about influence or prestige. But here's what's really happening. China is creating parallel supply chains, resource corridors, and strategic alliances that make sanctions less effective and increase Beijing's leverage over global trade. Let me show you what this actually means. Consider rare earth minerals, critical to everything from electric vehicles to missiles. China controls more than 60% of global mining and over 85% of processing capacity. When the West imposed export restrictions, China didn't just stockpile domestically. It exported selectively to allies like Japan, South Korea, and EU countries under terms favorable to Beijing. By controlling the supply, China transforms a vulnerability into a diplomatic tool. Here's what nobody tells you. This isn't opportunism. It's strategic planning decades in the making. When I was in Xi'an last year, speaking with logistics experts, they explained how multi-nation supply corridors are being optimized for resilience. Ports, railways, and overland corridors connecting Europe and Asia are no longer just trade routes. They're instruments of geopolitical influence. China can route goods around disruptions, secure key resources, and even pressure countries diplomatically, all without firing a single shot. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The West believes sanctions isolate China, but in reality, they push countries toward Chinese-led systems. Take energy, for example. European nations struggling with high gas prices are increasingly signing long-term contracts with Chinese energy firms, bypassing traditional Western suppliers. The very leverage sanctions we're supposed to give the West is being eroded. Let me show you the numbers that matter. In 2024, China accounted for 36% of global solar panel exports and over 42% of electric vehicle battery production, while simultaneously integrating production networks with countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. These are not incremental gains. They represent a structural shift in global manufacturing and supply chain control. And as China cements these networks, the impact of sanctions diminishes further. Here's a paradox that should terrify Western policymakers. The more aggressively sanctions are applied, the more China accelerates self-sufficient, globally integrated systems that reduce dependency on Western markets. It's a feedback loop few analysts anticipate and even fewer acknowledge publicly. Consider the semiconductor sector again. When U.S. export controls targeted high-end chips, China responded not only by ramping domestic production, but by forging alliances with Taiwan-based suppliers and companies in Singapore and South Korea. This diversified approach reduces exposure to a single point of failure, effectively immunizing critical sectors from unilateral Western pressure. It's a lesson in resilience, disguised as retaliation. This connects to something even bigger. The supply chains of tomorrow will be shaped not by sanctions, but by who controls essential nodes, ports, railways, rare minerals, and tech production. China is deliberately moving into those nodes faster than the West realizes. When we talk about winning sanctions, the metric isn't economic pain. It's structural dependency. And right now, that metric favors Beijing more than anyone expected. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Sanctions have a perverse effect. They catalyze 3 reinforcing forces: technological substitution, financial autonomy, and geopolitical supply chain control that make China more self-reliant, more globally integrated, and more resilient. Numbers don't lie. $3.2 trillion in reserves, 70% of rare earth processing, and multi-trillion-dollar alternative financial systems all point to the same conclusion. The West's strategy isn't weakening China, it's hardening it. Stay with me, because in the final part, we'll pull all 3 forces together into a framework that will change how you think about global power shifts. Then we'll explore 3 future scenarios, and I'll show you why the next decade could look completely different than what mainstream analysts are predicting. Now let me pull this together. We've covered 3 forces: technological substitution, financial autonomy, and geopolitical supply chain control. Individually, each one shows how sanctions are backfiring. But together, they form a system that is reshaping global power in ways most people don't even see coming. I like to call it the resilience multiplier framework. Here's why. Think about it. Every time the West applies a sanction, it triggers innovation at home, forces financial self-reliance, and accelerates global supply chain integration. That's not just survival, that's compounding strength. Let me show you what this actually means. In 2025, despite ongoing US and EU sanctions, China's high-tech exports rose by 9.8% year-on-year, while domestic tech investment surged to $412 billion, a record high. Those numbers aren't anomalies. They're proof of a systemic response that turns pressure into advantage. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. The West has focused on short-term economic metrics, trade deficits, tariffs, headline GDP growth, without recognizing the structural changes beneath the surface. China is quietly building redundancies, alternatives, and global influence that reduce the effectiveness of future sanctions. This is why the resilience multiplier framework works. Each force amplifies the others. Tech independence fuels supply chain control. Financial autonomy protects investments in both tech and logistics. Supply chain dominance creates leverage that further accelerates innovation and financial security. So, what does this mean for the next decade? Let's consider 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Strategic decoupling. Western nations double down on sanctions, attempting to cut China off entirely from critical technologies. If this happens, China's forces kick into overdrive. Technological self-sufficiency could leap forward, domestic capital markets could deepen, and alternative global trade networks could expand faster than anyone anticipates. In other words, aggressive decoupling might accelerate exactly the outcome the West fears. Scenario 2. Cooperative integration. Here, Western policymakers shift to pragmatic engagement, selectively lifting sanctions in exchange for trade and technology agreements. This would slow the pace of China's internal substitutions, but leave existing resilient structures intact. China would still maintain financial autonomy and supply chain leverage, but the geopolitical tension might ease slightly. Even in this scenario, the resilience multiplier is operational. It doesn't vanish overnight. Scenario 3. Multipolar realignment. The most likely outcome, in my assessment, is a global system where power is shared across multiple hubs. China becomes a dominant node in technology, finance, and trade, while the US and EU retain influence elsewhere. The resilience multiplier framework ensures China is less dependent on Western cooperation than anyone predicted, and its influence in emerging markets, energy supply chains, and tech ecosystems continues to grow. This is the scenario that most analysts are not prepared for. Here's what matters. Understanding these forces is not just about predicting China's rise, it's about recognizing a fundamental shift in the rules of global power. If you want to understand where the world is headed, you can't just look at headline GDP or stock indexes. You have to see the structural interlocking systems that sanctions are unintentionally strengthening. And here's what nobody tells you. These forces are deliberate, calculated, and coordinated at the highest levels. When I was in Beijing last year, talking to logistics and tech experts, the recurring theme was clear. Pressure is expected. We design our systems to turn it into opportunity. That's insider insight few Western policymakers are willing to acknowledge publicly. But it explains why traditional levers of power, sanctions, tariffs, export controls, don't work the way they assume. So here's the takeaway. The West's sanction strategy isn't just failing, it's creating a stronger, more resilient China. The resilience multiplier framework explains why, and it forces a reassessment of how economic and geopolitical power is projected in the 21st century. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of the 3 scenarios do you think is most likely to play out in the next decade? And more importantly, how should the West rethink its approach in response? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we'll be breaking down the next major shifts in global finance and geopolitics in upcoming videos. Trust me, what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, influence, and strategy in the modern world.